Hi, everybody. Welcome. Um, Thanks for having me. I've been thinking about what I'm interested in talking about, and I wanted it to be a little bit on topic of the retreat next weekend, which I wanted to focus on a Dogen festival called Bendowa, and then specifically on a particular kind of uh, uh, what's the right word? Idea? It's not an idea. Um, a technical term that Dogen uses in that festival, which is Jiju Zamai, which it means like the self-receiving. We usually translate it as the self-receiving and employing samadhi, or sometimes called the self-fulfilling samadhi. So this term samadhi comes from Sanskrit. It is Sanskrit, and you'll hear it rendered in Japanese as zammai, which is a phonetic rendering. And samadhi in early Buddhism means something more like a state of single-pointed concentration to the point of absorption. And the way we use it in Soto Zen isn't quite like that. It's a little bit more broad than that. And I mentioned that like a year or so ago when I gave a talk about the Song of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi coming from the teacher from I think maybe the 900s named Tozan or Dongshan. And um, and then that GGU, the word G means self. And then self, it's like, what does self mean? Um, and that's something that I wanted to talk about a bit. I remember when I was 20, I lived in San Francisco. I actually lived on Treasure Island, which is like this like human-made island made out of like landfill in the middle of the San Francisco Bay that I think was created to be part of like the World's Fair or something like that in the 1930s. And so there's the Bay Bridge that goes to Oakland, and in the middle there's a real island called Yerba Buena Island. Then there's this little like flat landfill that with houses on it, and I lived there. And uh, I don't know. I'm just setting the stage, I guess. I like context, but I used to go to the San Francisco Public Library, and which is right downtown, right next door to the Asian Art Museum, across from City Hall. And that was when I would check out VHS tapes. And there was this series of VHS tapes. I think there's maybe a dozen that was from BBC in the 1970s called The Long Search. I don't know if anyone's ever seen any of the Long Search series, but it's kind of like this guy, I forget his name, Ron Iyer, something like that. But he would travel the world, and he'd like basically do like a documentary hour on a specific like religion in a certain region. And there's two episodes on Buddhism. There's one where he went to Sri Lanka, and it was about Theravadan Buddhism, and it's called The Footprint of the Buddha. And then there's one where he went to Japan, and he called the one in Japan The Land of the Disappearing Buddha, which I think was an interesting title for a documentary on Japanese Buddhism. Um, and he goes to a Rinzai teacher named Kobori. And he says, what's the most important thing a person can do? And the teacher says, to know yourself. And I think I was kind of disappointed. I was kind of like, that's not really, I don't know if I wanted to, I don't know if that's like the most important thing to me. You know, I want to feel okay. I don't know if I want to know myself, you know, that seemed kind of like abstract or kind of like, I don't know, not intellectual, but just like I cared about how I felt, not about what I knew, you know. Um, and so that's been a little bit of a edge to kind of a point of confusion for me. Like, what is knowing the self? And you hear that term a lot. And the autobiography of a yogi guy, Paramahansa Yogananda, his whole organization is called the Self Realization Fellowship. And so sometimes you hear about self realization. And so, what would self realization mean? And it's really easy and tempting when we hear that to kind of be like, okay, there's this most true me that I need to discover. and that I need to bring forth in the world. I need to bring forth in my interaction. That sounds kind of, if someone told you that, you might not think that they were misleading you, especially if it was someone that had some kind of exterior, compelling things about them, or status or position that where they were kind of marked as someone that knew things. Um, and I think it's a little bit of a problem. And I think it's a problem that I kind of fall into a lot, that this idea that there's this kind of singular, most true me that I need to really uncover. I need to clear away all of the kind of like temporal, circumstantial versions of myself to find this singular, most true, most compelling, most wise and at peace kind of version of myself. And then we come into this Buddhist thing of like, well, there is no self, you know, and it's like, well, is that what we mean? In early Buddhism, there's this Pali term anatta. Atta is the Pali version of Atman, which is like the self-existent self, and an is like a negation. So anatta means it's not the self-existent self. So if you hear it's not the self-existent self, and then you say, well, there is no self, that's not quite an equal translation. Those are not quite, you're not saying the same thing in those two phrases. So there's a difference between the not self-existent self and the non-self, or the not, there is no self. Um, and then sometimes in Zen, sorry, I know that this is meandering and confusing. It's kind of supposed to be. We're kind of doing a survey about all the strange ways that we talk about self, and then we're going to get to, my favorite way. And then in Zen, sometimes we talk about, we try to, to clarify things, we kind of talk, well, there's the small self and the big self. And the self that we're not is the small self, and the self that we really are is the big self. I don't know if that really holds water in the light of the early tradition either. What are we talking about? Like, who are we? And I think what Buddha was trying to do in proffering this idea of anatta, it's like, that's an interesting question. What's the motivation for that question? Like who am I? It's like, where does that question come from? Like, who told you that you have to be something? Who told you that there's a you that you have to figure out what you are? There's this cool book series that I've never read called The Monk and the Robot. And the first installment is called, I forget what it's called. If anyone knows, I mean, I won't hear you, but it's called A Psalm for the Well-Built, I think is the first installment of The Monk and the Robot. And there's a android who's talking to a monastic. And the monastic is feeling very kind of what's the word? Like unfulfilled in life. I don't know if you've ever felt unfulfilled in life. But like, they have a whole history behind them. They did all of their things. They've done their good works, but there's still something kind of missing, And the robot says to the monk, he said, you humans don't really seem to get that you don't necessarily have a purpose. You're just animals, and your job is to exist and to breathe. And if you wanna be a beacon of goodness and light and wisdom and support for your fellow sentient beings, that's awesome. I'm paraphrasing. That's awesome, and I think that's a great thing to do. And it's also like, you don't have to earn your right to exist. What if I was just a composition whose job it was to feel existing? And so I think one of the things that we're doing in our practice is to really relinquish this idea of trying to either build a self, endeavor to create a personality that I'm carrying through life, and also not trying to build self, and also not trying to, I think part of like trying to figure out who I truly am is in a way not so dissimilar from trying to build a self, trying to create an identity here. And one of the things here is, and so we could hear that and think like, okay, well then our true self is to not have an identity. And it's like, no, that's not quite it either. You know, the identity arises, you know, and we don't have to reject it, but we don't have to have it be something vexing or fixed. When we talk about emptiness, when we talk about not self in Buddhism, we often leave out the kind of important qualifying aspects of that phrase, which is, the self does not exist as it is, as inherently existent from its own side. So what does that mean? Like if you take my phone, you know, does my phone, where's the phoneness? Does my phone inherently exist from its own side? From its own side mean it's kind of like doesn't rely on anything else to be a phone. And Buddha's whole thing was like, you can't point to anything that exists without reliance on everything but itself. Like my body, my thoughts, they're all created by things that are coming together. And the existence that they have is a provisional temporary existence. The existence of everything that you can look at is a provisional temporary existence. Some things last longer than others. They're recognizable in the form that they're in longer than others, like a rock versus a blossom. Yeah. Something just happened and I lost everyone. Sorry, forgive my fingers here. Is everybody still there? I don't see anybody now.
We're still here.
Okay, where did you go?
Existentialist.
Uh,
No self.
Let me try to. Hmm. I'm gonna switch to gallery view. Okay, there we go. Okay, cool. Thank you. Sorry about that. Um, what was the sentence I was on? No, stop. Yeah, the self that inherently exists from its own side. So if you read, like, this was a really exciting thing when I first came across this. I think one of the early books that I read about Buddhism was The Heart of Understanding, which is a very thin book by Thich Nhat Hanh about the Heart Sutra. And he was kind of describing what we mean when we say emptiness in Buddhism. And it's kind of like everything that you can point to is made of everything else. So he says sometimes when you're reading this book, you're holding a cloud and rain and soil and sunlight and labor, saws, paper mills, and things like that, ink, and all of these things. It's like, and so he kind of, if you extrapolate it endlessly, it's like the whole universe is in this page that you're looking at. And we could also say the whole universe is in this very body. So when we're trying to say, who am I? It's kind of like the answer, and we're trying to narrow it. We're going in the wrong direction. The answer to who am I is not narrow. It's endlessly broad. And it's just broadening and broadening. You know. So this can be a difficult thing to navigate emotionally, intellectually, because I think, it's hard to go from relating to everything from that worldview to suddenly not, and that can be kind of jarring and disturbing. And I think one of the things that is important to cultivate alongside with the meditation practice is to kind of relax into your life as much as possible and to create a life where you can have like as much as possible feelings of safety. You know, I think the recognition of the recognition of not self, the recognition of the lack of inherent existence of phenomenal things, including me, you know, are less alarming the more safe that we feel, the more stabilized that we feel, you know. And so our approach to practice in this GGU samadhi, this self-receiving and employing samadhi, self-fulfilling samadhi, is to tap into that felt experience, which does create that stabilizing sense, you know. So what is it to sit upright and just relinquish any ambition, you know? And if something's coming in that's confusing, being like, what do I need to figure out right now? You know, the heart's gonna pump, the breath's gonna come in and out, you know, and my job for this 30 minutes, 40 minutes, however long you're gonna sit, is to just feel the felt experience of existing. And if I can't tolerate that, to try to tolerate that I can't tolerate that, you know. And so this is one of the things that I kind of tell people when they're agitated, because when we do it, we get to find out that removing stimulation, you know, and creating the environment where our meanderings and our what Buddha would call papancha, which is mental proliferation, you know, the kind of images that come in and out and the narratives that arise. When you sit zazen, you're putting yourself in a situation where the narratives that arise are visible as narratives, you know. And in our usual daily life, the narratives that arise are not visible as narratives so much. They kind of feel like our direct connection with reality, like God's communicating to me what's true through the voice in my head, you know. And so in our practice, we're sitting upright to kind of create a stable, silent backdrop so that when you know, these composite, contingent, you know, reliant on history, reliant on karma, reliant on conditioning and external stimulation, when these notions arise and come into the, you know, our awareness, that we hold that hand open, we hold the hand of thought open, so that notions can crawl in and notions can crawl out, you know. And we're developing a what's the word? A tolerance, you know. Like you can get tolerance for things like, you know, nicotine or cannabis or hot sauce or whatever, you know. We're developing a tolerance to narratives that arise, you know. It's not that we can't hear them. It's not that we're shoving them away, and it's not that we're blocking them out. But it's like we know that this is what the mind does. It secretes thoughts, you know. And some of them are useful, and some of them are not that useful. And we can either become interested, or we have the capacity to not become interested. And when we have the capacity to not become interested, and we're experiencing the aspect of mind that is not the content of mind, that can be very interesting. That could be more interesting than the content, to experience the flow of mind as awareness itself, and to kind of step into that river of the luminosity of mind that is the underlying field in which notions can arise. And when I step into the luminosity of mind, which is the underlying field in which motions can arise, there's something soothing. So this is what Dogen calls the self, what did I say? Self-receiving and employing, but there's a shorter way to say that. What did I call it? I don't know. Self-employing samadhi. It's the samadhi that you can just like step into, the portable monastery, the portable hermitage. You know, the portable innate well-being that's at the center of things. You know? And it's not, And then that's why we say, it's not so helpful to say there's no self, because if you wanted to, you could say that that's a very truest version of yourself. The truest version of myself is the self that's nothing in particular. And I wonder if what it takes to have that be good news. I wonder what it takes to have that be a release for us. The self the truest version of myself, the truest thing that I am is nothing in particular. And what I'm experiencing is this once in not even a lifetime, but once in all of history constellation. What are the odds? What are the odds? What did Omaha has, I think, maybe the best Detroit pizza in the country. I think it's better than any Detroit pizza that I had in Detroit. And it's called Izzy's. And it's a little like box that you walk into, and they have like some picnic tables in the back with not a lot of shade, unfortunately. But when you have that crunch of the kind of cheese burnt into the wall of the pan pizza, it's just kind of like, what are the odds? Why would there be this instead of nothing? Or whatever your thing is, whatever the thing that moves you. I'm trying to make mine less consistently food oriented. I went to a doctor and she gave me it was this thing that comes from cognitive behavioral therapy. And she's like, this is a list of enjoyable activities, and they're all put out in bullet points. And I'm like, oh, that's really helpful, because when I'm going to go enjoy myself, I can't think of too much to do other than eat. So it's helpful for me to have a list of enjoyable activities, these ideas that I wouldn't come up with. But anything, when you look at the house plants leaning towards the window, it's like, why would there be that instead of nothing? So I think sometimes when you're used to relating to life in the way that we're used to relating to life, and you hear the self that exists is nothing in particular, that could feel like a hollowing out or a vacuous thing or a decrease in meaning. But I think if we're really stepping into this tradition and letting it do what it's going to do to us, and take all of these, not all of these, but I mean, the ones that feel most relevant and salient, take a lot of these ideas coming from the tradition as a working hypothesis of an approach to life. To not be dogmatic about things, but to also try things on as a working hypothesis, and to just be like, if each thing is this rare, once in history composition, like, what moment isn't imbued with just gravity and magic? Sometimes I have this habit of being very nostalgic. I reminisce about things. I remember one time I had a partner 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, and one of our first trips together, we went and stayed at a friend of hers' house in Hawaii. And we stayed in Hawaii for a month. And I was like out of money the whole time, and so a month in Hawaii with like empty pockets, sleeping on in like a borrowed twin bed, and with centipedes in the house, and geckos and centipedes. They have the big centipedes like they have in Japan. Um, and then afterwards, after the trip, I was like, oh man, I really miss Hawaii. And my partner was like, you hated Hawaii. You did not have a nice time in Hawaii, And it's like, oh, in my memory, I'm remembering all of these quality moments. And it's interesting when I remember things that I've done, or when I imagine things that I could do, I'm not bringing the buzzkill of the self that I can't help but feel. That's why sometimes we imagine things in the future and get really excited about them, and then they come around and they're not as exciting as we thought they were going to be. because our imagination didn't include ourselves, our felt experience of ourselves, the self that we can't help but see. And if we really step into the current of this tradition, I think one of the gifts that we can give ourselves is to really awaken to the nothing special and the majesty of being time. These moments where you look around, it's like this is the culmination. Wherever you are right now, you're in this room. I don't know what the temperature's like there. Maybe you've been sitting all day. Maybe you're physically uncomfortable. Maybe you're looking forward to something after the day, or maybe you don't know what you're going to do next, or maybe you're dreading a task that you have in the future, or something like that. And it's like this is the culmination of all of this moment. Uchiyama Roshi, who I borrowed the phrase "opening the hand of thought," he wrote a book on Zen called "Opening the Hand of Thought" in the 70s, and he says this interesting thing. I think he's quoting his teacher Kodo Soaki, and he says your life. It's a weird phrase in English, but it's like the self is the culmination of your life arising as the self. This moment is the culmination of everything. And if I'm not trying to get too obsessive about who I am, if I want to actually rather just kind of like enjoy the fact that I can experience myself as a self. And get curious about that field of awareness where all notions arise, and develop a relationship with that field of awareness where all notions arise, then I can kind of drink from the self-fulfilling samadhi. And that self-fulfilling samadhi is stabilizing, so that when we recognize that the self that I've been looking for is nothing in particular, that becomes like this boundless sense of freedom. So I want to expand upon Dogen Zenji's essay on this topic next weekend over the session. If you'd like to come, please come. I just did a session in Hokyoji, which is in the bottom east corner of Minnesota. Actually, to drive there, you have to drive through 3 states, but they're all within a mile of each other. And we did a session, and I couldn't help but notice how many anxiety-producing activities were built into the session. You have all these people that are trying to eat, and they're just trying to eat. Eating should be like an easy, nice time, and you could see the like terror in their eyes about not knowing how to do the meal in the formal way that we usually do meals at session. And then we're supposed to be in silence, but since there was so much formality, we had to make announcements constantly. So it's like after the meal, it's like you had to announce who the dishwashers are and stuff like that. And then, so I had that fresh in my mind when we were talking about the session next weekend. So my hope is to really try to make it easeful, to not give you any new things to learn how to do, to not give you any forms to learn how to do. I love that stuff. That stuff's gorgeous, but it feels when we have more time to learn and do them together, that's when they start to become richer. But in a weekend, you learn it and then you forget it, and then you just spend the weekend feeling nervous, So what I'd like to do is to try to make it a really easeful thing, but to also make it like legitimately silent, So that's what I'm hoping to do, and we can, and to give kind of practical instructions on kind of discovering and making contact with that kind of that underlying field, for lack of a better word, in which all of the sensations and notions are the field of awareness itself, recognizing the empty luminosity of the mind as awareness itself, and getting to relax this whole self-free project. Dogen Zenji says to carry yourself forward and experience things is delusional, and that mirroring things come forth and illuminate what's happening is awakening. So I feel complete in what I wanted to talk about from my own end.